welcome back to Wounded on Sixes. Today we're going to be reviewing the Adeptus Mechanicus detachments for Warhammer 40,000 10th edition. We're going to be going over the detachment rules, the enhancements, the stratagems, and ranking them as such, along with win rates and top finishes at top tournaments. Remember, these rankings are just my opinion based on the data that I've reviewed. Now, before we begin with the Adeptus Mechanicus Codex, I just want to say that my mind was definitely changed doing the research of this video. I kind of had it in my head where the detachments would lie in this ranking system, and I was kind of surprised once I really started digging into the data where a lot of these detachments ended up in my ranking. There's clearly a internal discrepancy inside the Adeptus Mechanicus Codex where not all of the detachments are created equal, much like we saw with the detachments in the Tau Codex. So we're definitely going to see a little bit of a quality shift in from the bottom three to the top three. But where those rank in the list is really, really interesting. So we're going to get started with the sixth, and what I'm thinking is the worst detachment in the Adeptus Mechanicus Codex, and that's going to be the Explorator maniple. Now, the reason that I'm going with the Explorator maniple is because it's a detachment that's based on choosing an objective marker. And then if the target of your attacks or the unit attacking is within range of that objective marker, they get +1, or they get to reroll wound rolls of 1. I'm sorry, it's not even good as +1 to wound. It's just reroll wound rolls of 1. So when you think about it this way, the detachment roll makes you pick, you get to pick a new objective each command phase, but you pick an objective, and then if you're within range of that objective or the target of your attack is within range of that objective, you get to reroll ones. Now think about what in range of an objective marker is. You have a detachment rule based on a very small part of the board. Like your detachment rule does not work if the actions taking place are not within that little tiny circle on the board. I do not like any kind of rule that requires either you or your opponent to be in a very particular place at a certain time in the game to get whatever rule they've given to you, particularly on the detachment level. It's very difficult. Now, there's people that'll say, well, what about, the warp of chaos and stuff like that. Yeah, sure. I mean, the shadow of chaos is a much better designed rule than this, and it also is a much larger area. So we're talking about a very small area where this detachment rule kind of pops off. So I gave this detachment rule a 2 out of 5. I mean, the good part about it is that you get to pick a new detachment rule each command phase. So you can decide to pick a different one or a more advantageous one the next turn. The problem I see is that if you're going first, your opponent's going to know what that acquisition objective is, and they're going to be able to play around it. And this detachment feels like a very beginner friendly detachment rule, but again, against like better players, especially in tournaments, like they're going to be able, especially if they go second, which you can't, or they go second and you go first, you can't stop that anymore in 10th edition. If you roll to go first, you just go first, and then they know what your acquisition target is every turn. So that's why I gave it a 2 out of 5. If I had to improve the rule, I'd probably make it +1 to wound rather than reroll wound rolls of 1. It just seems like it'd be a little bit more impactful for such a hard thing to pop off, having either being on that objective or having your opponent be on that objective to target them. Again, much better if you're going second, but if I had to change the rule, it would be add 1 to the wound roll. I don't think that would be broken in any way. Moving on to the enhancements, they're okay. They're not very expensive. I gave them a 3 out of 5. I think the best one is the janitor enhancement, which basically gives you a 4+ invul if you're in range of that acquisition marker. Again, another big problem with this detachment is that basically everything in the detachment is about that acquisition marker. So not only is your detachment rule tied to a very small circle on the board for a turn, every turn, but all of your enhancements and stratagems are too. So another reason why this is kind of at the bottom of the list here, because I do not like any kind of rule that makes you be in a very small area of the board to pop off. But a 4+ invul, if you're in range of it, I think is pretty good. The worst one is definitely got to be the Magos. Roll a d6 and you gain on a 4 up, you gain a CP if you're in range of that acquisition marker. That's a lot of hoops to get a CP generator. I mean, not only do you have to be in range of that little circle on the board, that could change every turn, depending on what you need it to do, but then still need to roll a d6 and get a 4 up to get the CP. It's just, it's a lot. I mean, it, it's a lot to input on there, and it's 15 points too. It's not even 10 points. It's 15 points. Just a bad enhancement, if you ask me. So yeah, 3 out of 5. They're okay, but they're not the best out there. Moving on to stratagems, I gave these a 2 out of 5. Again, a lot of them are dependent on being in range of that acquisition marker, which definitely brings them down a notch for me. Again, very small portion of the board. I'm going to say that the best one is the info slave skull. Basically, you can pick an extra marker for that turn until the next turn, which is pretty good. You get a lot of more utility, and it, especially if you're going first, it'll make it harder for your opponent to ignore your acquisition target. In terms of worst stratagem, I went with reactive safeguard. Basically, you can embark into a transport if you're infantry in range of the acquisition marker. Again, a lot of hoops to jump into, and you have to be the target of a charge too. So you don't just get to do this because you're infantry and just jump back in. You do it at when they charge you, but they have to be charging you. You have to be in range of the acquisition target. The transport needs to be right there. There is a lot going on here to try to make this work. So that's why I gave this the worst stratagem in the detachment. Moving on to some data here. In terms of win rate, it has a 43% win rate, which is the fifth best win rate in the codex, and it has 0 top finishes, which we're going to see a lot of these bottom 3 detachments have no top finishes. In terms of model range usage, I gave it a 4. It's mostly about objective markers, not about models. So you could use a lot of different models here. Anything tough that can kind of sit on that objective marker that you pick is really good in the detachment, but you could really use anything. To me, this feels like a very casual, beginner-friendly detachment. I could definitely see it like as a crusade or something like that, but definitely not something I would plan to bring on a tournament because I feel like newer players will get around your rules very, very easily. So that's going to be Explorator Maniple, the sixth best detachment in Adeptus Mechanicus Codex. Moving right along to the fifth best detachment in the admech codex, and for this I'm going to put the Cybernetica cohort, or the cohort Cybernetica as it's called in the codex. This is a detachment that has a lot of potential, but I feel like it needs some work. So the detachment rule is Legio Cybernetica units from your army gain the doctrine as imperative. So essentially, it gives the robots in the army the army rule, which a detachment that gives models in your army rule, to me is just a really bad detachment. I ended up giving this a 2 out of 5, but I was extremely close to giving this a 1 out of 5. And the reason is because one, the model range doesn't really support Legio Cybernetica besides one model. And also, if you look at the rest of this codex, or the rest of this detachment, sorry, there is like an entire vehicle detachment hidden behind this poorly written detachment rule, if you ask me. I feel like the detachment rule to be improved needed to have a second line to give your vehicle models something, whether it's rerolls to hit rolls if you're below half strength or something like that. It needed something else. It doesn't have it. And I think a lot of people kind of like look at this. They maybe look at the two robots that they have on their shelf and they're like, okay, I can't use this detachment, not knowing that there's like an entire vehicle detachment kind of hidden behind this. So that was pretty surprising to me. I'm also kind of surprised that this is fifth. I thought this would be a little bit higher in the rankings, but a lot of that is because the detachment rules just doesn't really help the rest of your army. It does make your robots better, but again, if you don't have a large collection of robots, this isn't a detachment that's going to be very beneficial to you because the detachment rule itself only works on one unit. Moving over to the enhancements, these are pretty good. I gave them a 3 out of 5. They're okay. They're all fairly cheap. There's no like super expensive ones. So in my mind, a detachment with some pretty cheap enhancements, even if they're not super great, is still beneficial because everybody needs to fill out the last couple of points in their army with some enhancements, and it's better if you have a little bit cheaper ones than super expensive ones cutting into your points. The best one I picked out was Necromechanic. Basically, you can change damage to 0 for vehicle models within 12 of the unit with that enhancement. I think you can only do it once per battle, but that's really good, especially keeping your Legio Cybernetica and vehicle units. This also works on vehicle units alive. Particularly against enemies' anti-tank pieces. They only get a couple of shots. They may only wound with one, and you may take the damage, but then you can change it to 0 and keep your tank alive longer, which is really, really nice. The worst one is the Arch Negator, where essentially you can give a Tech Priest anti-vehicle 4 on its ranged units only. It is only 10 points, so I can't bash it too hard, but not really impactful if you ask me, so that's why it's the worst enhancement in this detachment for me. Moving on to the stratagems, they're okay too. There's a lot here for vehicle units as well as Legio Cybernetica. Like I said, there's a hidden vehicle detachment in the codex here. I wish this would have been a little bit more flushed out. They're not the most impactful stratagems ever, so that's why I gave them a 3 out of 5. But moving on to the best one, I gave Machine Spirit Resurgence, especially allowing you to re-roll the hit roll below starting and the wound roll below half. If you ask me, that should have been the second part of this detachment rather than just the first part. This is almost exactly what I was talking about for improving the detachment rule. So yeah, that's why I gave it the best stratagem, because I feel like they could attack this on to the detachment rule and it's still been okay. Especially the way the admech codex came out, they have gotten better with the change to their army rule. The worst one is the auto divinatory targeting. You get +3 BS and ignore cover if you're near a certain objective. We just talked about how I don't like any kind of rule detachment ability that is based on a very small circle on the board. Getting +3 BS and ignores cover is okay. It's definitely useful, but I don't know if I would ever use a command point on it with how precious command points are in a game. Going on to data, as we're talking about win rate, this does have the worst win rate of any Adeptus Mechanicus detachment at 41%, and it again has 0 top finishes. In terms of model range usage, I gave it a 3, surprisingly. I thought it would be less because you have a detachment rule that only works for one model, but there is a hidden vehicle detachment in the Cybernetica cohort, and I think that there is some utility here. I'm even thinking about maybe trying to build a list for this, or maybe build a list for all of these bottom detachments just to see what I can get out of them. But the Cybernetica cohort, kind of surprising that it's fifth, but the detachment rule really brings it down. The win rate really brings it down, and it really could use a little bit more to it. It kind of feels a little lazy or rushed, in my opinion. So I'm going to keep it at fifth in the admech codex. Coming up next, fourth on our ranking scale here, and this is the detachment that surprised me the most when I was started doing this research. Usually when I start up one of these videos, I create a tier list and I just create a tier based on what I think before doing any research. And this one was at the bottom of the list, and now it's worked its way all the way to fourth since I started doing the research for this video, and that is going to be the Data Som Conclave. So I was kind of under the impression that this was the Tech Priest only detachment, and it kind of is, but it actually has a lot of legs. So its detachment rule essentially allows you at the first battle round to pick an ability that lasts for the rest of the game. So you only get to pick ones. That basically one improves the armor pen of ranged weapons for your Cult Mechanicus units, and then another one that improves the strengths and attack characteristics for your Cult Mechanicus units that charged. So I gave this a 3 out of 5 tentatively. I almost reserve the right to go back on it. I don't really like this detachment rule very much. The abilities are great, but the problem is that you only get to pick one, and then that's the one you run with. So are you going to be better at shooting? Are you going to be better at melee? The shooting ability is okay, but it's kind of negated by the fact that you can be +1 armor pen now if you're in the Conqueror Doctrina with Battle Line next to you. I mean, you could be AP2 now on those weapons, which is pretty good. But again, that only works in the Conqueror, not in the Protector. So, you're this is decent because then you're getting the AP bonus for your Cult Mechanicus units in ranged attacks, no matter what Doctrina you take. But there's not a lot of Cult Mechanicus units out there. What's very interesting is that Cataphrons are Cult Mechanicus. So your destroyers and your breachers could really benefit from something like this, where you can stay in the Conqueror and still get the +1 AP on their weapons, which is really nice. The other one is also really nice because you could be improving their ballistic skill in Protector, but getting a bonus on the charge to their strength and attacks in melee, which is pretty good, although they'd be hitting on 4s. So there is this kind of like weird juxtaposition between the Doctrinas and this detachment rule that you have to take, but I mean, it's kind of interesting. Again, if I had to improve it, it would be that you could pick one at the start of every round rather than one per game. And I think that's what really holds it back. It's what really wants me to put it at a 2 out of 5 rather than a 3 out of 5. But I can see a lot of fun and utility out of it, picking it right. And again, not a lot of models get this. All the Tech Priests will. Things like Belisarius Call is improved by this as well because he is a Cult Mechanicus model. So there is more utility than you think out there for this detachment rule, and the abilities are pretty powerful, particularly the one for charging units. This also makes your Fulgurite Electro Priest very good. This makes your Breachers way better, gives them more strength, more attacks, pretty good. I mean, I believe you can get your Arc Claw up to strength 9 and an extra attack on there, so 3 attacks per Cataphron is pretty good. There's a lot of utility here. Again, definitely could be improved if they change the detachment rule, but I gave it a 3 out of 5. Moving on to the enhancements, I also give them a 3 out of 5. They're all pretty cheap. They're all got some utility here and there. I gave the best one as their Temporcopia, which basically gives you a Tech Priest model in the unit fights first. That's really cool. Put that on some Cataphrons or some Fulgurite Electro Priest, and they could be a real issue to deal with, especially inside of a building or something like that. The worst one I gave was Mantle of Gnashtark. Excuse my pronunciation there. Basically, reduce damage to the bearer by 1. It's only to the bearer, not to the unit, so you can't put this on Belisarius Call either, so I'm kind of like, don't really like that. I don't really like enhancements that only improve the bearer, not the bearer's unit, so, that kind of made it an easy choice here. In terms of stratagems, I gave this a 5 out of 5. They're all 1 CP, so that's instantly puts you at 3 out of 5 no matter what in my mind, but they're also really good, and I actually kind of had a issue picking one that I didn't like. The best one I had was Chant of the Remorseless Fist. Basically, just add one to the wound roll. Really, really useful. The worst was Tribute to Empathic Veneration. Basically, subtract one from the enemy's hit roll, but they are required to fail the battle shock that you make them take. I don't like a rule that requires them to fail the battle shock to get the debuff, so that's why it was. That's why this one was picked as worst there. In terms of win rate, it has a 44%. Good for the fourth best detachment, which is right where I have it in my ranking. Zero top finishes for this. And again, I think it's because the Cult Mechanicus model range definitely needs some work. Speaking of model range, I only gave this a 2 out of 5. It works with the Tech Priest, it works with the Electro Priest, it works with the Cataphrons, and then it just doesn't work with anything else. They definitely need to improve the Cult Mechanicus or just finally merge Cult Mechanicus and Skitarii as one big blob. This is kind of like this detachment is a holdover from an army that used to be two different armies. It's the one thing I really wish they would just get over with Adeptus Mechanicus is keeping these things separate, like allow everything to just use the rule. They're not a separate army like something like Kroot is to Tau. But, I was kind of pleasantly surprised with this data conclave. I don't necessarily know if I have the models in my collection to build a list, but I'd be happy to try one out if y'all want to see one. But yeah, that's Data Conclave, the fourth best in the Codex. We're now going to move on to the top three detachments in the admech codex, and at number three, we're going to go with the Rad-zone cohort. This was the index detachment, and the detachment rule is not something I'm the biggest fan of. So, the detachment rule essentially allows you to do mortals to your enemy or your opponent while they're in their deployment zone before the first battle round. However, your opponent has a way to mitigate this. I don't really like any kind of rule that allows your opponent to mitigate what your detachment rule is. That's number one. I also really don't like detachment rules that require the enemy or your unit to be in a certain part of the battlefield either. So, my love for the Rad cohort has not really been present the entire edition, mostly because it's kind of against my personal play style. The round two gets a little bit better, where you get the fallout, where any unit that's in your opponent's deployment zone has to take a mortal on a 3-up and a battle shock. That can be kind of useful, and I kind of do like the round two. There seems to be a lot front loaded on the round one part of it, and that's just so easy for your opponent to get around. That's why I gave the detachment rule a 2 out of 5. Moving on to the enhancements, these are actually pretty good, and this is where the detachment starts to get decent, is the enhancements, which I gave 4 out of 5. The best one is the radial suffusion. Basically adds 6 more inches to the fallout ability of your detachment rule. Anytime you have an enhancement or an ability that makes a less than powerful detachment rule better is usually an enhancement I'm going to take. So that's why radial suffusion is the best one. In terms of the worst run, I think the autoclavic denunciation is probably the weakest. Adeptus Mechanicus model only. Ranged weapons equipped by the bearer have anti-infantry 2, anti-monster 4. I mean, I guess if you're planning on going up against something like demons or you're going up against something like Tyranids and you know that you're going to do that, that might be good. But, none of the Adeptus Mechanicus units are really, leader units in the area, really that good at shooting. I mean, do they really need this? Maybe. It's 15 points too, it's not 10. So that's why I put it at the worst enhancement in the detachment. We're going to move on to the stratagems. And again, I gave this a 4 out of 5. Pretty good detachments. It's a little pricey. I will give it that. The prices are expensive here. You have two of your detachment stratagems that cost 2 CP. That's a lot. That's a lot for Warhammer 10th edition, and they're not really that great either. The best one is probably lethal dosage. It's 1 CP, and in your shooting phase, any Adeptus Mechanicus unit can get lethal hits. It's especially good on things like Skitarii, Vanguard, that have very low, strength weapons, but a lot of them, and they used to have lethals in ninth edition, so this is a cheeky little way to get that back for them. The worst one is the Extinction Order unit. Has to take mortals, but it has to be within range of a tech priest and a certain objective marker. Just no, no, not at all. Again, a lot of the things that I don't like about a rule, you have to be in range of some like particular objective, and you have to roll to do a battle shock test, and it, it's a poorly written stratagem in my opinion, and it's not worth the 1 CP. I doubt you'd run it. Moving on to the numbers here. In terms of win rate, this is the number one detachment in the Codex at 48%, and it's number two in terms of top finishes with only four, though. So that goes to show you how poorly the admech codex did, particularly in the beginning of the edition. It's certainly done better and had more top finishes, but the Rad-zone cohort just wasn't that great, in my opinion. And the codex in itself has definitely it's definitely needed some help, and it's gotten it with the new rule changes. In terms of model ranges used, I'm going to go a 4 out of 5 here. You can use a lot here. There's really no limitations on what's good in a Rad-zone cohort. I personally like to try the prison lists if I can, to try to hem my opponent into their deployment zone to get the maximum out of Rad-zone, although I haven't had much success with the Rad-zone cohort. I think that's also why it's a little bit further down in my list, is just that it doesn't really fit my play style. It doesn't fit the way I like to play Adeptus Mechanicus, but I could see why in the right hands, with the right pilot, it'd be a really good detachment. So it's number 3 on our list. And now we're on to the last two detachments of the Codex. And I got to tell you, I had a real hard time picking between these two because I think they're both really decent detachments and work well with the models and the rules that the data sheets provide us. So while it was a tough decision, I ended up going with the Skitarii Hunter cohort as the number 2 detachment in the Codex. The detachment rule itself is very good, and what I like about it is it gives us a lot of durability on some units that really need it. The stealth ability, along with the basically army wide invul, helps a lot. And again, this goes on your Skitarii infantry, your mounted units, and your Iron Strider Ballistari, which I think is one of the keyer points too. That they're going to get stealth, but it also gives the Sicarans cover outside of 12 inches, which is really cool too. So you're getting a lot of utility out here. You're making your low toughness Skitarii Sicaran infantry very hard to remove off the board because you're not only dealing with their inbuilt invuls, but you're also dealing with the stealth and the built-in cover. Not that it's hard to get cover in 10th edition, but it is definitely a benefit. So I gave it a 4 out of 5 in terms of the detachment roll because it is extremely powerful and it makes some of the most efficient units in the admech codex work really well. You're going to see a lot of Skitarii infantry here. You're going to see a lot of Sicarans in a list like this. The Iron Striders are everywhere as well. But there's a lot of utility that you can get out of this, and again, anything that kind of helps improve the durability of low toughness models is really good when you can bring a lot of them for cheap, which you really can with the Skitarii infantry. So 4 out of 5 there. Moving on to the enhancements, again, really, really good. A little on the pricey side, some of them, but all around, there's not really many that you can say are bad. In terms of the best, I went with the Cantic Thrallnet. And again, this is just a personal choice, but I always like to be able to give my Ruststalkers within 12 inches of my Skitarii Marshal the ability to go into the Conqueror if I'm in Protector, just so they can get better weapon skill, or vice versa, give it to something like Cataphrons, where I want to put them I'm in Conqueror and I want to put them in Protector so that I can get the +1 to my ballistic skill. I really like this detachment because it gives you that ability to pick a unit within 12 and and give it the other Doctrina, and that's really powerful. 25 points, it's a price I'm willing to pay. Now, in terms of the worst one, and I'm using worst in terms of not that it's a bad enhancement, just that it's the most expensive, and that's the Battlesphere uplink. I know I'm going to hear a lot of hate on this, but again, I had to pick one at a very good enhancement, so I went with this one just because it's probably the most expensive. But you do get to make a normal move of 6 inches if you're not in engagement range. This is right after your shooting phase, so you could put this on your Skitarii Marshal, run up with some Vanguard, shoot, and then scoot back 6 inches. And it's not a dice roll either, so it is good. It's just expensive for that. I don't necessarily believe that you're going to want to put 30 points on your Skitarii infantry unit, but maybe you will. And that's kind of why I put it at the worst, because it is just really expensive at 30 points. Moving on to those stratagems, I gave these 4 out of 5 too. They're all pretty effective and, fairly cost effective. There's only 2 CP in here. In terms of the best one, I gave it Expedited Purge Protocols. Essentially, Advance and Charge. I love using this on my Ruststalkers or Infiltrators. It's really great to be able to just pop this and give one of those units Advance and Charge. It also makes it nice because the Ruststalkers get so many benefits from being within 6 of the battle line, like +2 to their advance, +2 to their charge, that like this stratagem really makes that ability that much better. So that's why I put it as the best one in the detachment. Moving on to the worst, I put Isolate and Destroy. +1 to wound, but the enemy model has to be 6 inches away from any other enemy model. Again, I don't like rules where your opponent can kind of mitigate them. Not that they know that you're going to pull this, but I mean, maybe it's good if there's a unit on a far out objective that you're trying to get to, but other than that, I don't know. I don't really think it's worth the CP. Maybe it may come up, but it may not. And I like stratagems that are more broad than that. In terms of win rate, this is the third best detachment in the Codex with a 46% win rate, and number 1 in terms of top finishes, which makes a lot of sense. It's a very competitive detachment, if you ask me. And in terms of if you're a good pilot of admech, you can get a lot out of this. I've seen some very good players pull, tournament wins with, units you wouldn't think, just because they get these extra durability buffs from the Skitarii Hunter cohort. In terms of model range used, I gave it a 3 out of 5. It could use any models in the range, but the Skitarii, the Iron Striders, and the Sicarans obviously are the better models to use. So 3 out of 5 there. But all around, this is a really good detachment. A lot of fun to play, and there's a lot of really cool stuff that you can do with the detachment. So that's number 2. And last, but certainly not least, we have the Halos Creed Battleclade at number 1. And again, this is my personal opinion, but I really like the Halos Creed Battleclade. I really enjoy the detachment rule. I think it gives you a lot of utility. There's a lot of choices. It feels very much like Adeptus Mechanicus 9th edition, where you had this huge command phase where you basically programmed your army for the turn, which is super flavorful too. Like, you have an army of computer robot men, and maybe it's because I'm a guy that works in tech. There's just something about that, like programming my army to go do what I wanted to do, my toy soldiers. It just it screams a lot of fun. The detachment rules itself is basically in a Strike Force battle, 2,000 points. You pick 2 units to become your Halo override target every turn, and they both get one of 4 abilities. Those 4 abilities are add 2 to your move, add 1 to your toughness, advance and charge, and to give the unit stealth. The advance and charge is just so good, especially if you have like rust stalkers or even like robots and the Cataphren breachers too. Like, nothing wrong with giving them advance and charge. That's really fun. But also the +1 toughness can be really impactful, especially on like your tanks, like your crawlers or your Scorpius disintegrators, things like that. It can be really fun. The stealth abilities also useful. I haven't found a lot of use for the add 2 to move characteristic, but again, that's also pretty good too. It can really get units up the board. I think a good use for that one is maybe if you have a unit of like sterilizers running around in your opponent's backfield, getting them extra 2 to move could be useful there. But there's a lot that you could do here, and it's a lot of fun to program your army. So I gave this a 4 out of 5 in terms of the detachment role. Probably 5 out of 5 if you ask me, but I gave it a 4 out of 5. I'm trying to be objective here. Moving on to the enhancements, these are all really good despite them being expensive. There's two 30 plus point ones here, but they're really, really good. The best one I gave was cognitive reinforcements, where you basically give a unit both doctrinas that the leader is in, and of course that's fantastic with Cataphren Breachers. Put it on a Manipulus, and now your Cataphren Breachers have every single keyword under the sun because they're in both Doctrinas at the same time. Add that to the fact that you can make them your Halo override target and give them all those other abilities we just talked about. Like, it's insane. It's so much fun. It's a lot. It's a lot to do. It's a lot of points, but it really makes for a fun play experience. In terms of the worst, I had to pick one. I went with Inloaded Lethality. Gives your Dominus or Manipulus, add 3 to the attacks characteristics, and add 1 to the damage characteristics for their melee weapons. Yes, it definitely improves them, but I'm already spending so many points on the cognitive reinforcements and also the dyad wafers, which we haven't talked about. That I'm probably not bringing this from my tech priest. But 5 out of 5 nonetheless. I mean, you could use every single one of these enhancements. They're all really good. Besides them being a little pricey, they're fantastic. Moving on to the stratagems, I went with a 4 out of 5 here. They're all really good. They're all 1 CP, so they're super cheap. And they all have use depending on how you've built your list out. The best one and my favorite so far has been the targeting override, where you crit on 5s. There's just so many uses for it. You could put it on your dragoons, you could put it on your iron striders, you can use it on your Cataphren breachers with a manipulus attached to them. You could use it on the casino gun, on the honor dragoon crawler. Like, there's just so many uses for it. It's a dice roll. It sometimes doesn't work. Sometimes you just don't roll a 5. It happened to me the other night. But when you roll a bunch of 5s, oof, boy, especially on those dragoons, why I run my dragoons in units of 2, just to give a little extra utility on the targeting override there. In terms of worse stratagems, I went with the guided retreat. Most of the units that I want to do this with, like the dragoons, can already fall back in charge. Same thing with the Iron Striders too. I believe they can fall back and shoot. So maybe I'm going to use this on some Rust Stalkers, but Rust Stalkers usually don't last in combat long enough to make this that useful. Maybe if you have a 10-man, but a lot of people don't run them in 10-man. They usually run little 5-man squads. So I don't know. Granted, a fallback and shoot and charge stratagem for 1 CP is good anywhere, but I had to pick a bad one, so I went with that one. In terms of win rate, 47% good for number 2 in the codex, and 2 top finishes. Good enough for number 3 in the codex, but this is an attachment that's been out for like 2 months now. So, 2 top finishes, 47% win rate. I'll take it. It's still Adeptus Mechanicus. It's still dealing with some pretty poor data sheets. But, if you can get everything working with this detachment, it's a lot of fun. And, I've kind of likened it to like you either know you're winning the game by turn 3, or you're losing the game by turn 3 with this detachment sometimes. So there's more playing around to do. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Skitarii Hunter cohort actually is better than this, but I think it's a lot of fun. In terms of model range, I gave it 5 out of 5. I mean, it makes all the models in your collection work. It makes the robots work. It makes the breachers work. It makes all of your tanks work. It even has some rules here to, like, let your Fulgurite Electro Priest get out of a transport and go ahead and charge. Like, it's got like everything that you could possibly want for your Adeptus Mechanicus collection. So that's why I gave it a 5 out of 5. So let me know what you think about this tier list here. I did do a lot of research. I was pleasantly surprised with some of the detachments. Let me know if you want to see me build a list for one of these detachments. Like I said, I don't really have the robots for the cohort or the data som, but I'd be happy to try to put something together for you guys if you really want to see that. And if you haven't, go ahead and like and subscribe. We're trying to get to 500 subs. We're almost there, and I want to thank everybody for watching. And make sure you come back for more Wounded on Sixes.